Good evening and welcome to our annual Celebrating Philanthropy event. I'm Anil Verghese, a graduate supervisor of the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program and associate professor in the School of Public Policy and Administration at Carleton University. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that Carleton University is situated on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. As settlers, visitors, and immigrants, we honor and respect the Indigenous peoples of this land. We are grateful for the opportunity to live and learn on this land, and we hope for a just future together. As most of you know, we hold this annual Celebrating Philanthropy event on the second to last day of our summer institute. Today, we have with us both the first cohort of our master's and diploma in philanthropy and nonprofit leadership, as well as our second cohort of returning students who are here for the second summer. Our students come from across the country, and they are diverse in every way, in their educational backgrounds, in their interests, and in their life experiences, as you can see from the bio book that has been circulated. This year marks the 12th anniversary of our program, so we are very proud to have both the 12th cohort and the 11th cohort with us today. I'm also pleased to welcome members of the Advisory Council who have taken time out of their summer schedules to join us in person, as well as the faculty and course instructors who work tirelessly to provide a quality learning experience for our students. Additionally, I extend a warm welcome to our sponsors, our guests, our well-wishers, staff, and community members. Our panel today, sponsored by the TD Bank Group, is titled Community Philanthropy, Canadian and International Innovations. We interpret the theme of community philanthropy very broadly to encompass the creative and imaginative ways in which locally driven philanthropy operates, as well as the more institutionalized engagement by community foundations. This concept has also come to refer to the various ways in which funders actively engage with communities and organizations that have been historically marginalized, shifting power from funders to the community. So our hope is to explore some of these Canadian and international trends in the community philanthropy landscape, examining the challenges and capacities of community philanthropy to act as a catalyst in promoting community-led development. And we aim to do this with insights from some of the innovators and leaders in this space. As always, our goal is to bridge the research and practice, assisting others who are beginning their journey to doing philanthropy differently and making it more impactful. As we turn to our panel, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Susan Phillips, and she will introduce the panelists. I know Susan doesn't need any introduction. She's currently the Chief Interim Advancement Officer at Carleton University. More importantly, she's the founder of the MPNL program and the former graduate supervisor, a professor in the Carleton School of Public Policy and Administration, and a leading scholar in comparative public policy for the third sector. Please welcome Dr. Susan Phillips. Before I turn it over to Susan, I also want to welcome Lee Rose, who is here representing our sponsor, the TD Bank, and I now turn it over to Lee Rose for a few remarks. Thank you.
Remarks sound so official. Thanks so much, Anil. It's wonderful to be here with all of you here today. This is my last official engagement before I take a month off, so I'm in a really good mood. So it's going to be a good night tonight. I also saw a former colleague of mine. Where's Nick? Okay, we got fired on the same day at a job, so ask Nick about that. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm really delighted to be here to offer some words of welcome on behalf of TD, which has been a proud supporter and champion of the Philanthropy and Nonprofit Leadership Program here at Carleton since its inception Some of you might have been expecting Joanne Ryan to be here. Raise your hand if you're expecting Joanne to be here. She's in Greece right now, so apologies if you're stuck with me today. So next to Joanne, I think I have the great pleasure of currently holding what I think is the best job at the bank. I get to lead our community engagement activities across Ontario, but I'd like to let you in on a little secret. I think I might have already spilled it. I'm not talking about Nick. So it's been 3 years since I've been at TD. This past February, Valentine's Day, great day to start a job. But I'm not really a banker. So I'm really an recovering executive director. I've been a program manager, a communications manager, a board chair, a volunteer coordinator, and like most of us in this room, I'm a forever fundraiser and a community builder. My experience was built over a career in the charitable and philanthropic sector. Much of that actually rooted in the field of community philanthropy. So I'm really excited to be here for tonight's panel conversation. That included a rather formative stint at Community Foundations of Canada, where I led the knowledge philanthropy practice. And I'm sure everyone knows what CFC is, but for those who don't, the national network for more than 200 place-based community foundations across the country. At CFC, as the Director of Community Knowledge, I led the organization's knowledge philanthropy practice and had the opportunity to work with leaders in community philanthropy from across the country and internationally, whose purpose and work were deeply rooted in community, which can be described as place or ethnocultural, religious, linguistic communities. And I'm so grateful for the time I got to spend in community philanthropy, for the relationships I built, for the mistakes I made, the lessons I learned from my time working alongside colleagues and leaders like those who are part of tonight's panel. So all of that has come with me to TD, where as part of my job, I get to build and steward relationships with organizations and initiatives that are supported by the READY commitment, which is our corporate citizenship platform. The READY commitment aspires to open doors to a more inclusive and sustainable tomorrow. So through that commitment, we're focusing on philanthropic support on 4 interconnected drivers that we believe, when acted on together, will have greater impact. Those are financial security, a vibrant planet, connected communities, and better health. Since the launch of the READY commitment in 2018, a key component of that has been a target of $1 billion in community investments by 2030 across those 4 interconnected drivers. And so to realize this ambition, we can't do it alone. We need collaboration, ideas, and action from nonprofits and community-based organizations, as well as from other funders and philanthropists. So that's why I'm really excited to be here today, to learn more from our panelists about the wealth of innovation that comes from the space of community philanthropy. And I'm looking forward to great conversations and connections with each of you afterwards. So on behalf of TD and me personally, thank you, Susan, and the entire MNPL team for the work that you do to support and enable leadership in our sector. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be a part of today's program. Merci. Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel, and I'm going to do that in the order they'll speak. Dr. Michael Layton holds the W.K. Kellogg Community Philanthropy Chair, the first endowed chair in community philanthropy in the U.S., at the Dorothy A. Johnson Center for Philanthropy at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Following teaching positions at Wesleyan and Yale, Michael founded and directed the Philanthropy and Civil Society Project at a prestigious university in Mexico City, where he developed groundbreaking research and advocacy to understand and strengthen philanthropy and civil society. So as a researcher, a teacher, a director, an advocate, and consultant, Michael's worked with a mixture of community philanthropy organizations throughout the Americas and brings to this discussion a very nuanced understanding of the unique challenges and capacities of community philanthropy to act as a catalyst to promote community-led development. Welcome to Canada, Michael. Thank you. Jennifer Brennan is head Canada programs at the Mastercard Foundation, Canada's largest foundation and one of the largest in the world. Jennifer and her team focus on partnerships with Indigenous youth, and their communities, and as the senior leader at Mastercard, connects to the work with youth in Africa aimed at securing meaningful, dignified work into the future. Jennifer's worked with and for Indigenous communities and organizations throughout Canada for over 20 years, leading negotiations on behalf of Indigenous nations and serving as Director of Strategic Policy and then Chief of Staff at the Assembly of First Nations. She serves as a governing member of the Royal Society of Canada and a board member of several Indigenous charities. Jennifer brings a strong sense of the importance of community participation, consensus building, and an overriding commitment to the affirmation and recognition of Indigenous rights and community-led direction. And importantly, Jennifer is an alumna of Carleton University. Rebecca Darwent joins us from Montreal, where she is founder of Philanthropic Advisor, which works with diverse high net worth families, foundations and companies to promote equity and justice through the redistribution of resources. She's the co-founder and continuing board member of the Foundation of Black Communities and was instrumental in helping the foundation secure $200 million endowment from the Government of Canada, and importantly, of forging new ways of working with community by shifting power. In 2024, Rebecca was named by the World Economic Forum as one of the most promising young global leaders, to add to her multiple other recognition as a leader in this space. And I highly recommend to you her TED Talk, How to Fund Real Change in Your Community. Kevin McCourt is president and CEO of the Vancouver Foundation, historically the largest in Canada. With more than 30 years of service to the nonprofit sector, both in Canada and around the world, he has earned a reputation as a smart, strategic leader who puts community at the heart of his work. Kevin led the Vancouver Foundation through significant transformations, important innovations, and extended impact through meaningful change at a community level. Before joining the Vancouver Foundation, Kevin worked with Canada's leading humanitarian aid organizations, including as president and CEO of Care Canada. Kevin also co-chairs the Federal Advisory Council to the Minister on the Charitable Sector, to the Minister of National Revenue, and he's a member of our Philanthropy Nonprofit Leadership Advisory Council. And for his many contributions, Kevin was awarded the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2013. So we have a panel with extensive experience in community, some in institutional way through community foundations, others in different ways, bringing international perspectives and working both at a local level, a national level, and an international level. We asked each of the panelists to give some opening remarks for 8 or 9 minutes. It'll be hard to capture all of their insights in that time. But then we'll have a discussion with a conversation about where this goes, and we'll open it to some questions from you. And then they have 1 or 2 minutes for very punchy closing remarks. Michael, as the academic, but not just an academic in our space, over to you.
Yeah, I wore my academic outfit tonight, so I would feel the role. What I want to do is talk about love and poetry. So don't worry, we're not on a bad date. I am going to talk about philanthropic research. So I read an essay that I really enjoyed called Where is the Love? And it was a reflection about the practice of philanthropy. And it's in a blog called HistPhil, as in History of Philanthropy. As a good philanthropy nerd, you should know about this. You should look it up. And Dana Dawn, who's studying community philanthropy in Vietnam, talked about how the love in the word philanthropy is often overlooked. And as we all probably know, right, philanthropy comes from 2 words in Greek, Philia, which is brotherly love, sisterly affection, happens to be the motto of my hometown of Philadelphia. And then anthropo for human beings, so love of mankind. But when we start to talk about philanthropy in a lot of our writings, we'll throw that out and then get to the real important stuff, right? The dollars, the metrics, the endowment size, the grant size, percentage of the workforce. And we leave out that philia, we leave out that human connection. And I think one of the great strengths and potentials of community philanthropy is to bring that love, bring that philia back in. So the poetry, don't want to forget I promised you poetry. One of my favorite poets is a woman named Mary Oliver, may she rest in peace. And there's a stanza from one of her poems called Sometimes. And this stanza only has 4 lines. Instructions for living a life. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. That's all. So what I want to do is share with you reflections about our most recent research projects and the things that grabbed my attention, that caused me astonishment, and share them with you tonight. So April 2nd, the Johnson Center launched a report called In Abundance about collective giving in the United States in partnership with a group called Philanthropy Together, which is global in its ambitions. And our friend here is also involved with them. And Rebecca focuses more on collaboration between institutions. And our work was on individual giving. For those of you that don't know, the Giving Circle is the most used phrase to describe this. And it basically means a group of people that comes together, they pool their resources, and together they decide where to direct those resources based on their shared values and priorities. So this can be a dozen people contributing $100 each. It can be hundreds of people contributing thousands of dollars. There's one group called Women Moving Millions, which speaks to the ambitions of this kind of group. And the thing that got everybody's attention was our estimates of the dollars that were being moved. And we estimated that between 2017 and 2023, nearly 4,000 groups mobilized 370,000 philanthropists to give more than $3 billion collectively in the U.S. $3 billion U.S., that's a lot of Canadian dollars, I'm sure. It's a lot. And we generated this research collectively. It was an effort shared by the team at the Johnson Center. And that's one of the strengths of having a center, is to have researchers. So I could rely on somebody that knew Qualtrics and survey research and could do statistical programs, the names of which escape me, along with a practitioner in the field and another consultant named Colmena Consulting that had subject matter expertise. But because we were a university-affiliated research institution, it had this sort of imprimatur of reliability and legitimacy that was so important. But the thing that astonished me about the research, billions of dollars is astonishing, but it was the stories that people told. And in the numbers, the impact that being part of a collective, of a community philanthropy institution like this made in people's lives. They tended to give more, to volunteer more, to be more civically engaged, and even feel better about their lives and their sense of agency in the world. And we tried to capture that. Another thing that astonished me, although this report is 140 pages and should have been called a book, if you go and look at it, and I hope you do, you'll see photographs and quotations of the people that we interviewed and were in those focus groups. Almost every page has the testimony of somebody that we touched in that research. And that, for me, that philia, the connection that those people had, the love they had for the work that they do together in philanthropy, was really what moved me. And you'll find the word love at least 16 times in that report. And I bet that's more than your average report on philanthropy. The second research project I want to talk about is in Mexico. And as Susan mentioned, I worked and lived in Mexico for a long time, 14 years. And there was a great alignment that occurred 2 years ago. The Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, also in Michigan, has a priority of developing, promoting the idea of community foundations in Latin America. And the country in Latin America that has the most right now is Mexico. It has almost 20. But less than half of Mexican states actually have a community foundation. Since I knew and I worked with those foundations, and we have a second endowed chair at the Johnson Center in Family Philanthropy, what we proposed to Mott was, let's align these two chairs and the strength of our research center and look at how family philanthropists connect to community foundations in Mexico to generate research that will help them strengthen those connections and ties and provide a model for how that research might be conducted and might strengthen community foundations throughout the region. So we undertook 50 interviews in 5 different cities in Mexico, and we'll be returning there at the end of July to disseminate those results. And as we were doing the research, Michael Moody, who was here last year, some of you might remember Michael, ran across this phrase. Someone in one of the conversations spoke in Spanish and used the phrase, detonar una conversación. And Michael said, what does that mean? I didn't catch that. I said, detonate a conversation. And it's quite a metaphor. When you detonate a conversation, you set off, you explode a conversation among people. So we want to embrace that metaphor about what we want to do to engender new conversations with potential donors across the country. And what has astonished me is how these leaders have stuck with the concept and have promoted this despite overwhelming odds in Mexico. You have a government that is really hostile, doesn't even begin to explain the attitude of the government, the current administration in Mexico. And we've taken to calling those local leaders evangelists, evangelistas. In the social science literature, our English colleagues use the term mediators, but this for us doesn't capture the emotion. Evangelist in the Greek means the bearer of good news, a messenger of good news. And that's what these people are, the good news of how a community foundation can be an instrument to transform a community. And that's what really astonished me about that research. So to wrap up, for me, the philia, the friendship, the connection that I enjoy with my colleagues at a research center, with a fellow chair, and then connecting with leaders in Mexico, the Alliance of Community Foundations there, Comunalia, the Center of Mexican Philanthropy, the people of Philanthropy Together, as we spread that out and we connect to that joy of community philanthropy, that's what really makes me excited to go to work every day and to come up here and have the honor of speaking with you, who are sacrificing what must be one of the most beautiful afternoons of the year in Ottawa. So I'm grateful for all to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
And we appreciate your sacrifice. So, Jennifer, you've been working in a different way with communities, both in Canada and internationally. And Mastercard has really turned itself around as a foundation in terms of how you engage, how you're consciously shifting some of that power. So tell us more about your work.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Susan. I really appreciate beginning at this place of sort of love and joy. And I'm going to try to add a few other ways in which we can come to this work with a way that really continues to energize and keep us focused on the work. I was also really appreciating the land acknowledgement and thinking about the way in which Indigenous knowledge systems as well help us understand the approach to the work. I'm thinking, here we are in Algonquin territory. We're just north of Haudenosaunee territory, the Akwesasne, and imagery such as the two-row wampum belt that we can think about that really speak to mutual respect and partnership, right? These notions that have been in this land for hundreds of years. You know, but the very first time of contact within Canada, we had conversations that led us to agreement around mutual respect and partnership. And these hold so true to every sector of Canadian society, and certainly to the philanthropic sector. And I think, you know, when I think of the Mastercard Foundation, as Susan mentioned, we're Canada's largest foundation, one of the leading global organizations. But at the heart, we really are grounded very much in these principles. And I think this has been really essential to shaping the work and understanding how, with a vision of a world where everyone has the opportunity to learn and prosper, you begin to understand, so how do we get this started, right? Where do we look? How do we connect? And how do we move the work forward? These can seem like very daunting challenges, and we can certainly be informed by great research and data and insights, but nothing replaces the ability of being in community and listening, right? Our approach has really come from an understanding that the people closest to the issues know the solutions. So the work of philanthropy in this case, those of us who are granted the gift of stewarding resources in the best possible way, we need to be in community, right? We need to be close to those that are closest to the issues. And you may wonder, you know, how does this happen on a global scale? So maybe I can unpack this just a little bit in terms of how it works within the Mastercard Foundation. As I said, it really begins with that powerful notion of listening and being in community, alongside community. The Mastercard Foundation began our work with very much a focus on the continent of Africa. And that resulted from global conversation, global listening, and really understanding that the importance of the continent of Africa, not just for Africa, not just for Africans, but for the world, for the planet. So really understanding that there was something that compelled the work to bring that kind of focus, and then bring it to a focus on young people. Young people, 70% of Africans in sub-Saharan Africa are under the age of 30. So really understanding how are young people and how can they be transformative agents of change, and what does that look like? So the Foundation's work really began in convening and listening with young people, and quickly led to significant shifts in our operations, as Susan alluded to. We began as a fairly small organization. Kevin recalls meeting our CEO when there was 5 people, not even logos on the door in Toronto. Really, really interesting, especially when I reflect on the fact that today our foundation has 600 people across eight offices. And this is in a very short amount of time. And so you might wonder, so what led to that? And this is a really critical point, because the growth has been directly in order to be able to respond to community, to accompany community, to have colleagues that bring deep insight into the work and challenges, that bring knowledge of ecosystems, and then can work and walk alongside our partners to align with the aspirations of partner organizations, and to really understand what it takes to be in partnership, to be in these partnerships of mutual respect and understanding. And very often, this takes different shapes. Very often it might mean, and I'm thinking back to some of our earliest partnerships in Africa with African organizations, and understanding that these were small organizations that needed support to build HR capacity, build finance capacity. So some of the very first grants of the Mastercard Foundation included commitments to build the capacity of the organization, understanding that if we're going to be a good partner, we need to build the strength of the partner to be able to walk alongside the partner. So never about solely project outcomes, aligning because we mutually aspire to ambitious project outcomes. Ambition about young people, serving hundreds of thousands of young people, but then understanding that we needed to support one another in that journey. I think that listening process led to really ambitious targets like that our grants in Africa would be 75% would be to African institutions. Within Canada, we have the same target, where 75% of our commitments will be to Indigenous institutions. Now, I can tell you, Other large foundations have told us we're crazy. You know, it's so risky. What are you doing? You'll never get to impact without those kinds of targets. But this was a direct reflection on the listening, on being in conversations with the agents of change in these different communities to understand that this was actually a huge part of the very change that we're seeking to achieve. And it was through that sort of support for institution building that we were going to enable that kind of aspiration. And on the continent, we've also set very ambitious target of enabling 30 million young Africans to have dignified and fulfilling work. And some may ask, well, so what does dignified and fulfilling mean? And those have been directly informed, again, by young Africans who've talked about what that means. It means feeling whole, feeling you have an opportunity to learn and connect to your work, being able to provide for your family. Likewise, here in Canada, we've set a goal of 100,000 Indigenous youth completing education, transitioning to meaningful work. And in the Anishinaabe language, very appropriate to this territory, Algonquin Anishinaabe, the concept of Minabewazwin is really what young people and elders have talked to us about. So it's not just about education for the sake of education. So not enough to back young people to complete a program, but really to support young people to be living a good life. And that means, feeling whole in your identity, being able to provide for your community, playing a role in your community, and moving forward. So all of these concepts require us to take a different approach to partnership, and one that we typically refer to as co-creation. So from listening to building a processes of co-creation, where we're walking alongside partners, we're understanding what does that journey then for the young person look like, and what are the different ways in which we need to invest. Invest maybe in language and culture programs. Invest in the support for creating new opportunities that are close to home, so you can stay close to family, close to community, and have a meaningful life. So this has led us in many different directions. Very clear strategy, very focused on enabling young people, but with many different pathways that are going to enable that holistic approach for young people. So co-creation means that our work is ongoing. It also means that it's highly responsive at the same time as being strategic. I think in the past, philanthropy sometimes thought, we have to make a choice. Are we going to respond, or are we going to stay true to our strategy, right? Are we going to be nimble and sort of figure out where we need to be based on what we're seeing, or are we just going to, lock in our strategy and move that forward? I think we've seen through co-creation that these are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they really come together. In order to be strategic, we need to be highly responsive to what young people are saying, to what institutions, the pains that they're feeling, the growing pains. I think about we've been able to support a number of Indigenous community foundations to take their first steps, to organize a board of directors, to really begin thinking through what their governance model would be. And all with a view to this being a powerful engine of great opportunities for young people through education programming, as well as moving forward. But we've walked alongside those partners, not to say, okay, well, this is going to be high risk because you don't have any experience, but to say, okay, what's the pace that's going to make sense for you? How do we support, maybe with those sort of HR policies and support? Let's start at a pace that's going to make sense. And invariably, we've heard back from these partners that have said, that slower pace was the best thing that could have happened, because it took the pressure off of us in order to not need to sort of run too quickly right up front. All of this leads up to a real commitment to impact that the foundation has had. We have very much a global board of directors, a very ambitious board of directors that have really considered that the work of the Mastercard Foundation must have a transformative impact the world over. Through focus, through community partnerships, but an impact the world over. So this means that our investments in Indigenous young people, yes, they support that individual. They support that individual to drive change for their family, for their community. But ultimately, this is change that is good for Indigenous communities, but good for the Canadian economy as a whole, and then much more broadly. You look at any issue really, from climate change to education, and the interdependence is so clear. So I think that we've very much seen that the impact, setting very ambitious targets around impact, and then enabling an approach that speaks to transformation through supporting the development of community institutions, walking alongside those institutions, moving forward, ensuring that we're showing up with the ability to learn and to be nimble and agile alongside partners, really enables us to think about change that not only creates resilience within communities, but also that sustains longer-term change that is needed, enabling young people to be agents and drivers of change and builders of new systems. When I think about the health system across the continent, one of our largest partnerships happened at the early days of the pandemic with the Africa Center for Disease Control, which enabled 65 million Africans to be vaccinated in the first year, in a context where, you know, early days, it didn't look like the continent of Africa was even going to be able to access vaccines. But you see the way in which supporting that kind of institutional growth had a really positive outcome. That partnership is now shifting to the manufacturing of vaccines on the continent of Africa. 2 vaccine facilities have already been created. So next pandemic, which unfortunately we all know we need to be ready for, there will be manufacturing of the vaccine on the continent. And it's young people, through their innovation and employment, that it's driving that new situation. So being able to be agile in partnership enables this kind of resilience, but also sustainability of our philanthropic investment. The philanthropic investment that enables young people to build health systems on the continent at a very large scale, and then also here in Canada, where we're working in the far northern regions of this country, where there's new health facilities, working with those communities to ensure that their young people can be the employment workforce. So it's not a workforce that needs to be flown in, that it's not a workforce that's disconnected from Indigenous cultures and realities, but it's a workforce that's driving forward Indigenous self-determination in health. So those are just some of the examples, both global and very specific here in Canada, where the work of philanthropy, through listening, through co-creation, and through a real focus of ambitious impact, that we can generate resilient and sustainable change for the long term. So thank you. Look forward to the conversation.
Thank you. There's so much packed into there. We can't wait to dig into. Rebecca, you were part of creating a new institution that's doing philanthropy differently, that is committed to shifting power to community first. Mm-hmm. So welcome your story.
Thank you so much. To start out, when you think about community philanthropy, there's so many different ways that we define it, and it's often place-based, whether it's a community foundation that is rooted in a place like a city or a province. When coming to the Foundation for Black Communities and what we now know of as an institution that has granted about $12 million out, when we were in the very, very early stages of mobilizing the Foundation for Black Communities, we were looking at having a home in philanthropy that was rooted in identity-based community for people of African descent. And Black communities in Canada had been and continue to be, quite frankly, excluded from the philanthropic sector almost entirely. Many of you in this room have read the unfunded report and are familiar with the findings, but for those of you who haven't, I'll just reiterate the data that came out of the groundbreaking report that was released in 2020. Ultimately, we found that for every $100 that goes out of Canadian philanthropy, as little as 7 cents was going to Black-led organizations. And so we had and continue to have a reality where there was no relationship with Black communities and there was no trust. When you talk about philanthropy, the thing that I have chased my entire career is following where the money goes. And when you see the dollars explicitly not going to Black communities, you ask why. The unfunded report really articulated that the lack of relationship led to systemic barriers. And so, you know, it's interesting to be with you all in 2024 because now I can talk about the Foundation for Black Communities because it is a reality. It is an institution. It has been able to succeed in our audacious, wild, as Kevin will recall, dream of having an endowment that had over $200 million dedicated to, and more importantly, led by Black community members themselves. So self-determination has been our driving force from day one. And what I want to be able to tell you a little bit more and dive into is what the untold story of the Foundation for Black Communities is. And many people will look at large, big announcements like $200 million stewardship. That's a huge announcement, but the backstory is far more interesting to me and something that I am immensely proud and honored to be part of. The untold story is really about community mobilization. And the state of affairs for Canadian philanthropy really had that lack of accountability to Black communities and lack of participation of Black community members in philanthropy. In 2015, I was working for a private family foundation and was very much part of all of the circles and conferences. And I can tell you that there were very few people who looked like me, and it was less than a handful. And the moment that I got a call from co-founder Liban Abokor, and he talked about the idea of a foundation that would be dedicated to Black people in this country, it was an immediate yes for me. I didn't care how long it would take to get off the ground, but I knew that we needed to fill that gap. And here's some of the juicy ways that we've been able to make that happen. Okay, so in terms of taking a completely different approach to philanthropy, a sector that had, as I said, really excluded us, we were able and have successfully now applied the concept of Ubuntu, which means that, you know, I am as you are. I see you and your success and your livelihood and flourishing is dependent, mine is dependent on yours, right? And we use these Afrocentric principles and values in every step of our foundation and how we do our work. So there's three key ways that we've been able to do that. One is in our entire campaign to develop the endowment. We used a call and response mechanism. So Liban called me, I picked up the phone, I said yes, I called someone, and it was just a really important groundswell of mobilization from the very, very, very grassroots. We're talking about aunties sitting at kitchen tables, grandmothers who were looking out for the next generation, community soccer clubs that were also a food bank. Black people have always found a way to use mutual aid and be accountable to one another. If I am in a conversation and I am not respectful to an elder, and it happened throughout building the foundation, or just like miscommunications, somebody calls my mom and is like, hey, I heard that this happened, what's going on? You know, there was a lot of grumbling of movement and mobilizing of dollars, and our audacious goals had an element of kind of calling in a sector that had excluded us. And so when we talk about shifting power, sometimes that is disrupting, and sometimes that is difficult. And so I have accountability to community, and community holds me in a really privileged position. Philanthropy, status quo philanthropy, doesn't have that same relationship and accountability. And as a result, we just have this woeful underrepresentation of Black people within the sector, as well as the funding that I mentioned. So how have we done things differently now that we exist as a pillar organization within the country? You know, we often talk about this pipeline to leadership, that there's not Black people out there ready for those leadership positions. We did a community nomination process for our board of directors. You didn't have to have a title of a CEO. You didn't have to have the endorsement of a senior executive. Instead, it was really a community member saying, this is somebody that I believe in. We didn't look at the titles because we know that Black people are not always promoted in the way that they should be. They don't have access to the same roles that they should have. And so we just turned that whole thing up on its head. And I'm really proud to say that we had, I think it was almost 200 names put forward from coast to coast to coast. All the way up in the north, we have dear colleague Judith, who is in the north, and so we have a real representation of community leaders that came and have that accountability and connection to ties, like I said, across the country. That looks very different than sometimes in private philanthropy, where no posting goes up and it's an appointment process, and there is no transparency, not even a job posting or a reference to the board position on a website. We were very, very active in ensuring that that was a transparent process. Another way that we have turned kind of traditional philanthropy on its head is by using a participatory grant-making model and using a process where as applications for granting goes out, there's also an ability to become a community member who will review the grant applications. And you know, participatory grant making is kind of falling into another buzzwordy part of the sector. But what is really cool is that even though I sit on the board of the Foundation for Black Communities, I have zero decision making about the dollars that go out the door. It's community members themselves that are making those decisions. And that also is something that's really exciting to see. It's not who you know. You don't have to brush your shoulders with people at a special afternoon dinner party or whatever. Like, this is really honoring the expertise that exists within our communities. We know what works for us. One of the greatest joys that I have is meeting people who have received funds from the Foundation for Black Communities. Even in the earliest days of our work in the pandemic, we were doing some micro grants to just get mobilization and knowledge out about COVID vaccines. And with that early granting program, there was two organizers that I met just actually on Parliament Hill the day that we got the announcement. So that's the big splashy story. But the cool behind the scenes story was this group that was working in Western Canada had received grants for the first time ever, and it was a Rastafarian couple. And I know in my bones that they had never received funding before, and I know in my bones why they had never received funding before. But I could see that that was a moment that they were able to have dollars and mobilize for youth in their community in a way that's culturally informed, that is accessible, and I believe, and I mean, time will tell, that will be more impactful than some of the restrictive dollars that they might have received before. So I'm excited to dive a little bit more into this with my colleagues on the panel, but I'll just close with the difference or the shape-shifting that I think is required for the sector right now is not just to empower others, but it's to go one step beyond that and support creating your own table. So the Foundation for Black Communities, we've created our table where we're setting the priorities and we are making decisions about where dollars go. And I think a big reason why that hasn't happened in the past is because of the lack of trust And we're able to do it in a different way with the Foundation for Black Communities because we have ownership and self-determination around the dollars. So we have the ability to do it in a new way and test and be joyful and playful and not be fearful of like, what will someone say, or how do we circumvent all of these no's.
Great, thank you. And Kevin, you've led change within an existing, a well-established organization and have done some very innovative and impactful things in a slightly different route to that.
And the great thing about, or maybe the hard thing about being the fourth speaker is I've changed my notes several times. Oh, I did say that. But I wanted to acknowledge that when I was asked to speak at an event celebrating philanthropy, I'm like, yes, I celebrate philanthropy every day. I want to be part of that. But you might, because I live in an organization that has abundance, that has power, has all these, has history, has connections. So I can celebrate my work in my community every day. But you might wonder, well, what do you not see what's going on? Do you not see what's happened with Black communities? Do you not see what's happening in Indigenous communities? Do you not see? And I do see, but I still celebrate because Vancouver Foundation is in a place where it can actually change. It's an organization that has the wherewithal and the history to be able to celebrate, but also not become blind to the fact that we're on a constant learning journey. And I also want to just back up a little bit as well, and to just talk about some of the environment that we work in. And I see Callum here as a great historian. He can probably tell me the date of this, but Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, was it 1898?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, we'll pick that. But a little earlier, yeah, probably, yeah. So it's old enough. But it has had a remarkable influence on philanthropy. And I'll just read a little bit from that. Andrew Carnegie says, a little bit of a paraphrase here just to shorten it, "Those of wealth must become the agent for his poorer brethren, bringing his superior wisdom to do better for them than they could do for themselves." That statement has had a profound impact on philanthropy in North America, and it's still out there to this day. I see that when we get new board members who wonder, who's deciding? What's the process? Or donors who've made their money and have been successful and think that success translates into other areas. And Carnegie didn't create this sentiment, but he captured it well, and it has not gone away. And so we're, as a sector, but I still celebrate the fact that many of us understand that is history, and there's enough of a community that wants to change that history, that wants to center the voices of community, have been working with organizations like Foundations for Black Community, Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund, a long list of other organizations to recognize that for far too long we have not centered the voices of those most made marginal by the systems that we work in. So I'll tell you a little bit about our journey along that. It's 81 years. I'm not going to go through every year, but I will characterize the Vancouver Foundation of 1943 is what someone recently referred to as a Chamber of Commerce charity. So I thought that's a really good image. It captures the image of the Chamber of Commerce, and not to denigrate chambers of commerce, but it's a type of organization that and it comes from a history. It's got a set of characteristics. And but Vancouver Foundation, recognizing it's a community foundation, has always been in tension with the Carnegie approach of we understand what is necessary. We've been successful. We will help, but recognizing as a community foundation that's really not why we're here. We're here to identify and be responsive to the priorities of communities, organize our resources, and respond. And so the foundation's done a number of things over the years to try and live into that aspirational position. In 1972, the foundation, its annual report said, this is the year of the volunteer. And the innovation in 1972 was created the first citizen advisory panels to make grant decisions. Up until then, from 1943 to 1972, the board did it. And the board did it at the Vancouver Club. And the board, but in 72, but if you look at the composition of those advisory committees in 72, they don't look like they do now. Because the Chamber of Commerce expanded its network. And so, but it still really didn't go as far as they could have, but they started. And that laid the groundwork for us to just continue. When I joined the foundation in 2013, I found an organization that was very successful on all the kind of traditional metrics, but was kind of lived a world of let's do more social good. Yet the voices that we were hearing quietly were saying, that's not good enough. We need to do social change. And having spent 25 years in international development in organizations that had really, I'd spent my career trying to organize resources to respond to priorities of communities around the world, I brought that to Vancouver Foundation and said, well, how can we then shift from social change to social good? And the shift that made sense to us was to adopt a systems change lens, to recognize that the foundation, even as big as we're not big enough to be a social security safety net, but we can influence that net. And we can grant in ways, and we can change our application processes, we can change our adjudication processes, we can change everything we do about giving money away to try and help change systems. And we did that from kind of 2015 through 2018 and felt pretty good about ourselves, celebrating philanthropy, centering community voices. And we evaluated our program. Juniper Glass, who also well known here, alumni of the program and a consultant, pointed out to us that you're helping to create the conditions for system change, but here are 75 things you could do better. and so, thanks, Juniper. And the key thing is, she said, you just really haven't leaned into centering voices. And so that was the challenge that was faced with us. And so we redesigned a lot of our grant programs. We launched new ones. Now it's the Thriving Indigenous Systems Fund. We launched specific grant streams around granting to racialized communities. We substantially revamped and this is the other things, you have to change kind of the machinery of the organization as well in terms of, so we did things as profound, but also in hindsight as simple, as having the board approve the allocation of money to program areas, but have the advisory committees make all the granting decisions. And so, like Rebecca, I have this, I think people think I make grant decisions and I get invited to events because people think I have power, but I don't. And that's quite deliberate. And so we've changed the management systems in ways that the board, and what the board does is to ensure that we have followed the procedures as opposed to approve the grants. And that's been a significant shift as well, to try and have the organization really lean into our current understanding of what community philanthropy is. It will change. And we hope that as an organization, communities will hold us accountable and keep us changing, and that we have a staff and a board that are leaning into that those calls. I think one area where we have not made a substantial degree of progress compared to many other organizations has been around all of our assets. We a very successful grant maker, a very successful fundraiser. We're doing about triple what we were 10 years ago, so we're granting $150 million a year, bringing in $150 million a year. Our endowment has doubled in the 10 years that I've been there. And we've only recently, we've made a number of advances in terms of ensuring that our endowed assets are socially responsible, UNPRI, ESG, but I think there's a long way that we can go to demonstrate that it's not just the granting process that is community inspired and center community voices, but that our endowment is doing that as well. And so that's one area where we are leaning in, recognizing we're not at the forefront of aligning assets with our vision, but we now, again, making some changes, changing who's on the board, changing who our investment partners are, working to slowly change a big system that now 81 years old and by no means thinks that it knows everything, but feels that we've got a lot of trusted partners that we work with who will help us on the journey. And the other, maybe I'll wrap up with one comment around why we were eager to support the Foundation for Black Communities in its establishment and creation. And it was a conversation I had with Liban about how does an identity-based foundation fit with a place-based foundation? And you have identity-based foundations, place-based foundations, experience-based foundations, linguistic foundations. There's all kinds of different organizations. And our conversation was, how do we ensure that that doesn't lead to the atomization of our society? That we create all of these very, positive, passionate groups of people that are isolated from each other. And we said we really have to talk about how we're creating a tapestry of organizations, that just get your mind around away from isolation and atomization, but really look at how those organizations strengthen each other, how Community Foundation is made richer by diversity, how it's made richer by the multiplicity, and don't buy into the argument that there are too many foundations or there are too many charities. It's look at how all of those organizations can actually work together as manifestations of community. Every single one of them has community members behind it, at the board, at the staff, at the fund that believe in that organization. They say, this is a manifestation of my community. Let's celebrate that. Let's listen to it. Let's weave it together and carry forth and send Andrew Carnegie to the history bins.
All of you in some way talked about the reciprocity of philanthropy and building trust, building social trust, whether it's among giving circles or perhaps with communities you've never worked with before. How do you do that? How do you start that? How do you start that process? How do you succeed at it? What lessons do you take away from how you've built trust? Because obviously you have in different ways.
I could start.
You start.
For us, it was actually staff. When we created our Indigenous Priorities program, the commitment was that it would be a fully Indigenous team. When we launched our racialized grant-making community, the same commitment. So for us, it was staff. It was hire the right staff that believed in the program, that had the capacity. So for us, that was the key thing. And then having the second component of that was the board and the organization needed to trust that we had hired the right staff and that they were able to build the networks, the programs, and the advisory committees. But for us, it all started with staff.
Mm-hmm. Jennifer.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, completely agree. And then I also think, it may sound obvious, but the reality that you have to earn the trust too, right? And what does that look like? And I think, for our foundation, sometimes people say, I had no idea this large foundation that's actually a Canadian foundation. Why haven't we heard about it? Well, there's a really clear reason for that, because we've made a very deliberate choice in terms of our partners and the work speaking to the action, right? So you won't ever see the Mastercard Foundation out in front of the work. Really, we recognizing that we need to earn that trust, and then the work will speak for itself, right? And the work and the people behind the work will speak for itself. So really sort of thinking through what is going to earn that trust, and sometimes it takes time, it takes a great deal of listening, but then also earning it through the action and through the impact, right? And being there through that process of engagement.
I would think about the relationship and partnership that Foundation for Black Communities has with Vancouver Foundation. I think we had to build trust. And one of the biggest results of that was just acknowledging that we'd have to do things differently. And that there was almost like a mutual skin in the game. And that was what was created over individuals talking to individuals. Like when we talked to Vancouver Foundation, we were talking to Kevin and Dara. And it wasn't like we all had to take off different pieces of the professional armor that was like, well, maybe I could have a conversation with our board of directors or key partners in a different way. Maybe we could step out of the bounds of what we're locked into. And philanthropy is like a magical space. It doesn't have to be the boxes. Exactly. It for whatever reason, it's become a lot of gatekeeping. And I think trust is built when you open the doors to the gates and just say, like, let's try something a little bit different and have mutual skin in the game.
And you work in a country, Michael, where trust, generalized trust and trust of the political system and of many institutions may not be rigorous or strong.
Yeah, Mexico in general is in the Gallup World Values Survey polling. generally is low. Latin America in general is low in terms of generalized social trust. The answer to the question, can you in general trust other people? And we found that when we did surveys related to giving, low levels of trust in organizations, and I'm sorry to go trip down memory lane here. We took a survey done in the US, translated it in terms of language, and then translated it in terms of culture through working with a lot of focus groups, and added a question which was, how do you prefer to help? By giving directly to a needy person or through an organization? And it was between 75 and 80% of Mexicans said, I prefer giving directly to a person. And when we went and shared these results back out, I got a lot of pushback. And people said, well, you didn't talk to my community because my community trusts me. And the big thing was why? Why is that? And when we did the survey a second time a few years later, we added a follow-up question. If you chose give to an individual, why? If you chose giving to an organization, why? Both cases driven by trust. If I give 10 pesos to a mother in the street with a baby, I trust that she's going to use it to feed her baby. If I give to an organization, it's because I trust that organization to use it wisely. And so organizations have that burden of work. And I was invited, the Association of Fundraising Professionals has chapters in Mexico with the same name, oddly enough. And the title of my talk there for that gathering was, The Competition is in the Street. Like, you're not competitors in this room. You have to worry about why people are making that decision to give on the street. So the generosity is abundant, but it is channeled informally. And you won't see the same results. And coming back to this issue of trust, one of the things that I did when I founded the Philanthropy and Civil Society Project, we wanted to talk about reforming the fiscal framework for charitable contributions in Mexico. And we started with conversations. And we not only had conversations in Mexico City, where the university is located, we went out to the states and talked with community foundations, because they could convene the local leaders, the donors, the organizations, the business leaders, local elected officials, accountants and lawyers, to have those conversations. And I honestly think by doing that, by going out, talking to them, taking seriously their concerns and their input, going back out and talking with them again to say, this is our agenda for fiscal reform, what do you think? It built up such a reservoir of goodwill and trust that when the Mexican government in 2007 proposed eliminating tax deductibility of donations, eliminating tax exemption of organizations, we had something like 2,000 organizations sign on to object and to oppose it. And I think from 2007 till today, I have if you will, banked on that reservoir of goodwill with those organizations, some of the same leaders then, who now trust me when I go back and I say, I want to talk to your board members and to your donors and the people in the community, because I want to learn about how family philanthropists view your foundation. They'll open the door to me and trust me that I'm going to be respectful and I will listen first and foremost. So I think that respect and literally and figuratively meeting people where they are is indispensable, whether you're conducting research or running a foundation. I'm sorry, I took too long.
So speaking of conversations, Jennifer, the Mastercard Foundation doesn't take applications, correct? You have conversations. So two questions embedded in that. How do you determine who you're to have conversations with? And that must take some time. So the second is, how do you manage that with with an audacious agenda, how do you manage that? Go slow to have the conversations, but also go fast to get the more audacious things of the mission accomplished?
It's a great question, and I think very often it is how do we balance that, right? And how do you also work in a way in which you're always thinking about what are the innovations that are needed to drive beyond the status quo, right? In areas where we see the need for significant shifts and significant change, you need to be working at that sort of cutting edge with those really transformative leaders, transformative institutions that are being experimental and that are pushing boundaries. So that very often is what takes you into the right conversations. And then it's our partners themselves that lead us to those conversations, right? Where they're leading us to where they're seeing a difference being made and what those opportunities are to scale and at what pace. So I think it's a mix of those things. It really is being in community, being able to be surrounded by partners and others that enable you to then understand what are those opportunities to go deeper and how far. I think we also have a huge opportunity and strength in the organization, and that we have a board of directors that continually pushes us into new networks and new opportunities, because they themselves reflect those communities in terms of how to be ambitious and grounded and bring forward really some rigor in terms of what are we tracking, what are we learning. I think at the end of the day, we see ourselves as a learning organization. So that means sort of constantly being aware of our ecosystem, who's doing what, and what are we learning, what are we seeing. So a lot of our work might be a little different than what you think of typical philanthropy work, in that we're not spending a lot of time reviewing applications. We're spending a lot of time learning and in conversation in order to then be able to drive forward a conversation about what would it take to move faster? What's the right time? How do we do this? What could we learn together, right? Those are the questions that we ask that then drive the partnerships.
And you must have invested in the infrastructure, meaning that the staff, the local staff and partners to have those. How did you make that in terms of the real investment? And Rebecca, that applies to the work that you've been doing as well.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Kevin and I had a quick conversation right before this, and I think this is the interesting opportunity too, where yes, absolutely, the foundation has invested in ensuring that we can be local. My team is right across this country, and accompany partners from coast to coast to coast on partnerships. The same in the continent of Africa, where we have incredibly talented colleagues that come from different sectors, come from the agriculture sector or environment sector. But we always are asking the question about, is it about staff within the foundation, or the huge preference we have to enable the partner organization to have that strength and capacity in a way that's sustainable? And what is that dialogue, so that we are supporting the growth of institutions and very much acting sometimes where we're demonstrating an initiative, we're piloting an approach that then is able to go to scale through more support and capacity building. So I think I completely agree with Kevin that the preference is always to not say what are the resources that we need as a foundation to make the right decisions, but how can we align with a partner and ensure they have the capacity that is needed to drive a bigger outcome going forward. Did you want to weigh in on that one too?
Maybe just to amplify it, as I use a series of simple maxims to try and run my organization in my life, and one of them is with my granting staff that their first instinct should always be, who can you grant to, not who can you hire. And we're really experiencing the rub of that now, because in relational-based grant making, you actually have to hire. You can't, and so you're trying to find the right balance of not wanting to be a donor that has a big staff and a big establishment because you want the capacity to be in your partners, but recognizing that without enough people to have a relationship, you can't really find that sweet spot. So it's a constant tension in an organization, and that's,
Agreed.
Yeah.
Why aren't more Canadian foundations doing what you're doing? Each of you in different ways. And Michael, you might have comments on how you see innovation happening internationally. Or maybe they are, but what does it take to move in the direction that the examples, your experience has been?
Oh, maybe I can just start, and I'll only I'll limit my comments and observations to community foundations because that's the ones I see most of, and I can identify what are some of the characteristics of Vancouver Foundation that have enabled us to be on this path compared to some of my peers. And the real kind of magic is that we have a high proportion of unrestricted funding, that we as the foundation have agency over how it's spent and who gets it. And that's been the result of those 81 years of us working with donors. So we have 1,000 donor advised funds where donors identify charities they want to fund, and we happily write the checks, and well, they're ETFs now. We happily do that. We have 500 charities have their reserves with us, which we manage, and then give them a dividend check every quarter. But we have other funds where the donors have said, Vancouver Foundation, you make the decision. And they might condition it by saying, here it's for environment, or it's animal welfare, or it's others, but they let us decide. And then we have other money that comes in completely unrestricted. And that is, for us, that's about half of our money now. But we're 50-50 in terms of fulfilling the wishes and the deeds of other donors, and 50% is out at our discretion. And that is highly unusual in community foundations. Many may only have 5 or 10% of discretionary money. We're all as a collective trying to get to the point where a community foundation has more discretionary money so that it can respond to the voices that are not being listened to, or don't have a fund at the foundation. So that's been the kind of the secret sauce for us. And it's been many years in the making, and but it's a long-term process for community foundations to transform. But also, right, even today when they're talking to new donors, they're asking new donors to set up funds, but have the discretion to the community foundation, and by extension, the communities that it's serving.
I think it's a little bit different for the Foundation for Black Communities, so I'll speak from the vantage point of community-led collaborative funds. So Canada has some incredible shining examples that are making waves on an international stage. So with a different hat on, with my philanthropic advising hat on, I'm in conversation regularly through my work with Philanthropy Together and the Gates Foundation on highlighting foundations and collaborative funds that are doing things differently. So within Canada, we have the Equality Fund, we have Right Relations Collaborative, we have the Foundation for Black Communities, we have the Indigenous Peoples Resiliency Fund, all organizations taking a radically different approach. And it is beyond frustrating that we have like trailblazing organizations that are being recognized internationally that are not getting the capital transfer and the fundraising support that we need to see for that long-term success of those institutions. And so for every Vancouver Foundation partnership that FFBC has, we have, many no's and many unanswered phone calls and roadblocks that comes to that capital transfer. And so why aren't people and why aren't other organizations doing the work that we're doing? It's because I think of fear and risk aversion and unwillingness to let go of that decision-making power and control. I talk about green lights in my work, so the philanthropist, individual, and family foundations and partners who want to do things differently and are ready. And so I think trust-based philanthropy requires just shifting to new institutions, new organizations, partnering in different ways, in creative ways, so that we can see different impact and different outcomes. Because if we keep doing what we've been doing for the last 80 years and don't do the shift that you're encouraging new partners and new donors to come to, just say like, let the community make decision, we'll continue to have fragmented and ineffective results.
Jennifer, Michael, do you want to add anything to that? Or?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely true. I think that there is a great deal of fear and risk aversion. I also think, often there's a bit of a disconnect too. And you were speaking about this in terms of, there's sort of a closed door or disconnect between those in philanthropy and those at the community level. And I think there's a huge opportunity to break some of those silos and engage in the conversation. But I would suggest it's on both sides, right? I think about the time, the decades I spent at the Assembly of First Nations, and I was always sort of frustrated. Why isn't there a better relationship with philanthropic organizations? On this hand, I've got all these Indigenous communities who need everything from a school bus to a school lunch program to, major infrastructure support. Surely there's a philanthropic organization out there that I can match them up to. At the time, we were far too busy to actually do the work of investing in what was going on there. But my experience was that both sides were frustrated in the relationship. Philanthropic organizations were also saying, we don't know who to talk to. We don't know where to begin the conversation. Nobody's kind of returning our calls. So what do we do? Right? So I think creating very different spaces, and breaking down some of those silos so you can have a kind of risk-free conversation too. I've certainly been in spaces now in philanthropy where you enter a room and it really is about a conversation to learn together. And before you can even get started, you're being pitched with a million different tiny ideas, all wonderful little ideas, but I'm not there to have that conversation. I really want to understand and genuinely want to understand. And maybe there's a much bigger idea we can get behind. So I think it's creating those opportunities for those conversations. We're not very good at that yet. Mm-hmm. I think we can do a lot more in terms of convening and having both sides of the conversation coming together to really understand what are your interests, how do we align, and then let's build something together. As opposed to this model that we've kind of fallen into of philanthropy comes up with an idea, sends out a request for proposal, community has to figure out how to fill it in, and then it's a little bit of almost a confrontation, right? Because you're trying to squeeze yourself into somebody's proposal. And when you were saying that we don't do requests for proposals, and that's not because we don't want ideas. It's really because we wouldn't know what to ask for until we've been in conversation. Yeah. Right? So it's sort of flipping that to sort of say, how do you begin a relationship? You begin by understanding one another. And I think if we can create the spaces for that to happen that don't create those risks for either party, it'll go a long way.
Michael, do you want to add anything? You may not. It's a Canadian question, so I don't want to put you in a spot.
I won't take the easy way out. It's such an important question. And just to add a little bit of personal experience to what already I think has very eloquently been said. There's a saying in the U.S. I don't know if you share it up here. If you want money, ask for advice, and if you want advice, ask for money. It seems like it is known. I think back to the relationship I developed with the Charles Stewart Ma Foundation. Back in the early 2000s, the program officer would come to Mexico because they were funding community foundations. And I was the only researcher writing in English, and he didn't read or understand Spanish at that point. So I was an easy point of entry. He wanted information, so we'd go out and have breakfast and talk. And he came to know me before I made any ask of any support. And so I've had a relationship that's been characterized by mutuality and conversation because the question of money was not on the table. And once the question of money and its twin brother power, and I do say brother intentionally, once that is involved, it gets harder to have those conversations. And I'd like to live in a world where that happens. But I think it's much more challenging to do. And one of the most memorable quotations from the collective giving work that we did a woman who's a dynamic leader in the Latino Community Foundation said, "Money without trust is poison." And I don't know if she was channeling Edgar Villanueva or if that was her, but it's a very powerful statement.
Indeed. I haven't left much time for questions, but we do have, we can take a few. Does anyone have a question they want to pose?